If I started this video by repeating the same sentence over and over again, it wouldn't make you want to keep on watching, would it? The same happens with video games. Doing the exact same thing over and over again gets boring and tiring. To avoid this, most game developers try to squeeze as much content into a game as possible to give it some replay value. It is, for a lot of people, a determining factor when judging if a game is good or not. The same goes for Sonic games. There are plenty of ways where developers try to add replay value depending on the game genre, such as multiple endings, billions of ways to level up your character, you name it. Sonic games usually have their stages as the main form of replayability, getting every collectible, perfecting each run, and trying to get the best time possible. Basically, speedrunning is the biggest replay appeal. The classics have established this concept since the first title, which has been a stamp of the franchise since then. A lot of other games have their replay appeal based on the same thing, with a lot of them being partially inspired by Sonic, in which their levels are built in such a way that incentivizes speedrunning, finding new cuts and shaving off every single fraction of a second off of your record. Roguelikes are also really good for this, since you usually play almost completely different levels every single time, which keeps things fresh and will always challenge you to get the best run possible. Of course, this can also be very tiring, especially when the game isn't very fun to speedrun. This can be one of two things. The first being that the game is so difficult to speedrun that only absolute nerds can consistently speedrun it, and the other is the game not being good or fun at all, because one of the primary aspects that contributes to replayability is the game being good in general. Well, if a game is shit, you won't want to play it again. That alone is enough to completely ruin your game's replay value, as people won't want to come back to it and will only get frustrated when playing it. In these types of games, there usually is a fake impression of replay value. This usually happens when a game has a short and troubled development cycle, where developers are forced to recur to certain techniques in order to draw more playtime. A perfect example of this would be Sonic 06. In Sonic 06, for anyone who doesn't know at this point, you basically spend half of the game on loading screens. This wasn't done on purpose though, it's just because the game is kinda messed up. I remember playing the entirety of Sonic 06 for that NPC video, which you should definitely check out by the way, and I remember the game as being a very long experience, but analyzing the footage, I saw that a lot of that time that I remembered in my head as actual gameplay was actually spent on loading screens. Another thing that made it feel very long was the extreme amount of backtracking that you do. Firstly, the hub worlds in that game are really big, and sometimes not necessarily so, especially the Soliana Forest hub world, which is more often than not completely empty and absolutely massive. Secondly, you usually play through stages you've already gone through again during the story. For example, in Sonic's story, you have to go through Wave Ocean again with Tails, with no real design changes nor any real explanation as to why you're doing it. Of course, hub worlds, when done correctly, go a long way into creating a meaningful universe for a game, which, in return, might make some people want to experience it again. Such examples of this are the hub worlds in SA1 and Unleashed, which, although basically only a way of linking stages and the story, are alive enough to keep things interesting and unique. And, more recently, the islands in Frontiers. They aren't exactly what I would consider hub worlds, as they are much more than just a connection between stages and the story itself, but since they also serve that purpose, I wanted to include them, as they are great since they incentivize exploration and are just really fun in my opinion. It's also really fun when games either introduce or allow fun challenges to be played. For example, in Sonic Heroes, people have tried beating the entirety of it either only using Sonic, Shadow, including me a few years ago, although with an absolutely terrible video, or other characters. More recently, there have been people trying to beat Frontiers without leveling up, beating SA2 without rings, or even completing the 2D games without going left or right. You can literally search "Can I beat Sonic" on YouTube and a ton of videos like that will pop up, which are fun to watch and to try as well. Another aspect that might influence someone to return to a game or not is the story. As I referenced, the confusion that is Sonic 06's story is, more often than not, the root cause of a lot of the issues the game has, which inherently destroys its replay value. The story, when done right, is usually a good enough reason for people to go back and play a game. Of course, if the game isn't that good, it will drive away a lot of people, sure, but a good story goes a long way into creating replayability for a game. Good examples of this are SA1, SA2, Unleashed, and once again Frontiers. I know it hasn't been long enough to make basically any claim about it yet, but hey, let's see if it holds up. When I replay those games, I usually never skip the cutscenes and dialogues because I'm genuinely interested in watching them and actually go through the lore again. Even though I already know what happens, I feel like that if I dive into the game's story and universe again, it just gives me a good enough reason to keep going. Of course, the games are really good either way, which helps a ton with the replayability, but it just hits different when you're actually paying attention, even when you already know what's gonna happen. Another good example of this in my experience, although not a Sonic game, is with a game called the Talos Principle, a game that, realistically, without the multiple mods and DLC, has zero replay value. And even with that, I keep going back to it. Why, you ask? Because I just love the story, the atmosphere, the music. The gameplay can get kinda tedious when you're stupid and have already finished the game a billion times, but it's always worth it. Sonic games almost always perfectly set the right atmosphere and always have absolute bangers playing, which is a big plus and help them a ton with people wanting to go back to them and having fond memories of playing them. Although it's not always that a good story saves a game, and that is the case of Sonic Heroes. Before I get killed, I would like to clarify that my favorite game of all time is Sonic Heroes, so now with that said, I'm legally allowed to criticize it. The story in Heroes isn't anything spectacular nor anything terrible. It's good enough for what it tries to be. The problem with it is that you have 4 stories, right? But in each story, you go through the same levels with some design changes, but nothing game changing. I actually don't mind this that much, but I get why a lot of people do. It's fake longevity. It's playing basically the same game 4 times over and over again, and it isn't any real replay value. To unlock the true ending, you actually have to play the 4 stories and collect all Chaos Emeralds, which might seem too much for a lot of people, and it's honestly understandable, even if it doesn't bother me. This might not be an issue of the story specifically, but rather the story being the way it is because of that development choice. But still, playing the same game 4 times to unlock the true ending is still kinda fucked. Another game that suffers of this, which I cannot defend in any way, shape or form, is Shadow the Hedgehog. Unlocking the last story requires you to see all 10 endings of the game. This means playing through the levels of each possible path again and again, having to play the final levels at least twice and choosing the opposite mission to face the other final boss of that level, and having to play Westopolis 10 times. That is absolutely mad. There are also some games that have good stories that are not affected by the gameplay, namely the Storybook series. The gameplay is just the way it is because of the Wiimote. Another thing that I believe makes for unnecessary and not fun playtime are excessive mandatory collectibles. This is not usually an issue if you only need a few like the Chaos Emeralds, but I'm specifically talking about something like the medals in Unleashed. I know that negatively talking about Unleashed is forbidden in at least 100 countries, but hear me out for a second. Does anyone truly enjoy this gimmick? I know that they are almost completely optional in the SD version, but in the HD version you literally have to collect them to progress. This wouldn't have been such an issue if you only had to collect a few medals in the whole game, but you have to collect 120 Sun medals and 80 Moon medals to finish the game. There are also more medals to collect, 200 of each to be specific, which you need to collect to 100% the game, which can be fun and challenging if you're into it, but realistically most people aren't. I have come to a point in my life where I basically know every single medal location location in the day and night acts of Windmill Isle, which keeps me going for a while until I have to collect more medals, which usually requires me to scour the hub worlds and replay levels multiple times. The game is really fun, which helps with this, but it can actually work against it, as I just want to play more of the game and make progress, not play the same level over and over again until I have enough medals or until I'm sick of it, especially when the Werehog levels can take as long as 20 minutes to complete. It's too much, honestly. Entering a positive note, do you remember how I mentioned mods a bit ago when talking about the Talos principle? Well, yeah, Sonic games have plenty of them. Not only do they have plenty of them, but plenty of incredible mods at that. What modders are able to do with the games is honestly God's work, so massive shout out. Of course, this many good mods adds a ton of replayability to the games themselves, although at the modders' merit. But yeah, modding is a big part of what defines Sonic games, so it's always a guarantee that the community will find and create enjoyment even if there isn't any. But yet, there is still one thing that is crucial to a game's replayability that I haven't mentioned yet, and that, unsurprisingly, is personal enjoyment. If you enjoy a game, as flawed as it may be, you will probably want to replay it someday. Those parameters I mentioned may mean nothing, which most of the time, for casual people like me, that is the case. As long as you enjoy a game, it may objectively have no replay value whatsoever, and yet you will want to replay it. And that, for me, is the most important part, the personal enjoyment. With that said, I want to rank what I think are the 5 Sonic games with the most replay value. I will try to be as objective as I can, but since it is my opinion, it will always be influenced by personal enjoyment. I also asked a few of my friends for their opinion, which I'll cover afterwards. You may connect more with their opinion than with mine, which is fair. So for the 5th spot, I will go with Sonic Mania. I think we all agree on how incredible this game is. The 2 possible stories, if you have the DLC of course, along with the multiple characters that you can play as, which change things enough to keep the game fresh, is always a reason to look forward to playing it, along with the other things it does right, like the gameplay, soundtrack, art direction, design, and basically everything else. For the 4th spot, I think I'll go with Sonic Riders. It may seem like a weird choice at first, but hear me out. Riders has, in my opinion, the best gameplay of any spin-off in the franchise, and better than some main titles too. It's difficult to master for people who have never played it before, but the feeling you get after actually learning how to play is honestly worth it. The story mode isn't anything to write home about, but it's in the gameplay and the act of mastering it where the fun is at, while listening to its amazing soundtrack that it's honestly one of the best in the franchise. For the 3rd spot, I think I have to give it to Sonic and Sega All-Stars Racing. Not transformed, but the original one. I know this one may be even weirder than the last, but I do have to admit that this one is 90% affected by personal enjoyment. Usually, racing games are very replayable since you can always come back to them and not be disappointed with what you're playing. What you see is what you get. It just depends if you're happy with that or not. This one is one of those games that I'm never disappointed with, and have very fond memories of playing it a few years ago. So whenever I do go back to it, I just enjoy it a lot. It just kinda depends on which one of the 3 racing games you prefer. But yeah, it's an incredible racing game and I recommend giving it a try if you haven't. For the 2nd spot, I'll go with Sonic Adventure. This is, for a lot of people, one of their favorite games, and I'm no exception. Everything about it just brings back good memories. Be it the gameplay, the soundtrack, the design, the atmosphere, the story, everything about it just brings back good memories. You've got 6 different stories along with the last Supersonic story, which, individually, are all really good, except for the big one, as we all know, which keeps things fresh and engaging, for me at least. And that is basically it really. I don't have much to say. I like to replay it because I just like the game. And in first place, I think I gotta give it to Sonic Generations. Although I have to say that it's not the game's merit entirely. Sonic Generations is a good game in itself, sure, but once you finish it, there isn't much to do besides some missions and just replaying and speedrunning the stages. They aren't anything special nor anything terrible. They're just there if you want to play them. But there is more to Sonic Generations than meets the eye, and that is the mods. The modding community of this game is absolutely massive. There are tons tons and tons of mods for you to play with that completely change up the game. It's honestly almost impossible to get bored if you do enjoy playing the mods. So yeah, when replaying Sonic Generations, I almost always do it with mods, which sometimes is basically playing a completely different game. Other Sonic games also have very good mods, sure, but none beat what the modders of Generations could do with it. I also said that I was going to cover my friends' choices that you can see on the screen. I was originally going to cover each pick individually, but there isn't much to say about them. It just comes down to their personal enjoyment, as I said. With all of this said, what really brings good replay value to a game? You might argue, as I did in the start, that it's got to be variety, a good story, good gameplay, just to name a few requirements, which all do go a long way into creating replayability for a game. But at the end of the day, the most replayable games are those that you enjoy the most, even if you don't replay every single game that you've enjoyed. They may all have variety, good story, good gameplay, and some might not, and yet you still enjoy them, and that is what matters. Your favorite games may have many flaws, and by all means acknowledge them, but don't let anyone ruin the fun for you. And with that, we're done. I hope you enjoyed it. I would like to read about what you think makes for good replay value and what you think are the most replayable games. I would also appreciate if you subscribe, as it helps me out a ton. And I have a Twitter if you want to follow me there. And that's it really. I'll hopefully see you soon.